everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast. And as usual, I'm joined by Tracey Besters from the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. Hi, Tracey. How are you? Great to see you on the Zoom and for another session.
Thanks, Darin. I'm doing really well. Winter has definitely setting down here, so it's lots of Ugg boot weather.
Yeah, well, way too cold for me. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by Super Fund Property Valuations. Take the tension out of tax time by making Super Fund Property Valuations your number one choice for all your SMSF property valuation requirements. Order a report today by filling in your details online at www.superfundpropertyvaluations.com.au and let Superfund Property Valuations take care of the hard work. And of course, again, massively important area. A shout out to Will Spark and his team. They were on the Professionals Day event with us, which we just concluded not so long ago. And he was fielding all sorts of questions about property valuations. One about having a wind farm on an
Oh,
SMS.
really? Okay.
So there's all
Interesting.
sorts of ranges of areas that he looks at. So fantastic to have his support and fantastic to be listening to the valuations he was or the advice he was sort of giving around valuations on those sort of a little bit different areas, I suppose you could say. But we're not
Yeah,
here to talk about valuations per
we are not.
se today. We're returning back to our three-part series of some strategies in the lead up to the end of the financial year. So we've done must do's, we've done should do's, and
Yep.
now today it's a more positive slant because it's about could do's.
Absolutely, Darren. And I think that the end of year planning, I get really excited when it gets towards the end of financial year. I'm putting my big accountant hat on here, and because accountants actually get to celebrate two end of years, Darren. We get our June end of year, and we have an end of year celebration, and we get our normal December end of year. So that's pretty exciting. So we're leading up to the June end of year. So what sort of resolutions can we set for our super funds moving forward? That's what today's session is about.
That's a very positive outlook, Tracey, and unique to us in the Southern Hemisphere too, because the financial year in the Northern Hemisphere usually is the coincides with the calendar year. So we're unique like that. Anyway, we'll get on with it. Um, some of the stuff you want to highlight revolves around changing life circumstances, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
preparation for that, because it's like any end of year, be it financial or calendar, it's probably a time that people do reflect on these things, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Darren. And the message that I've shared with my clients over 25 years plus is about that reflection, about using the end of financial year as a time to reflect around, well, okay, what are we expecting for the next 12 months? What's happening in our life? And we talk about planned and unplanned events quite frequently. And these are some of the planned things. What's happening? Like, are we turning a certain age? Are we, do we have other changes to our family structure or our life cycle or our lifestyle that that are going to have some impact or could have an impact on our self-managed super fund? So that's what this part is all about. And I think the first place to start, Darren, or the first place I'd like to start is around, I can't believe we're only a few minutes into the podcast and we're talking about trust deeds already, which is really interesting. Scott Hay-Bartlam will be very happy with us. Now's a good time to think about the trust deed upgrade. So I'm still seeing at the coal face, and I'm still seeing with clients that come to see me and talk to me, I'm still seeing some old deeds. And I'm talking, like late 90s, I'm talking, somewhere in the 2000s, I'm talking 2010s, I'm seeing quite old trust deeds. And, it's just a good time to think about, well, okay, should we be upgrading the trust deed? Should we be bringing it into 2025 world and actually, upgrade that trust deed? And, so many times I've had the question asked of me, Darren, but what's changed in my deed? Can you review my deed and tell me what paragraphs are changed? Well, clearly that's not an efficient way of dealing with the trust deed. And the number of hours it would take for me or somebody else, a lawyer perhaps, to actually read the deed and tell you exactly what's changed, it is not cost effective. So this is why we have providers in the marketplace that can do these trust deed upgrades. So first thing, New Year's resolution for the SMSF: is it time to update your trust deed? And if it's probably 4 or 5 years plus old, then it's generally a good time to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't necessarily have to be things on your radar to understand why your trust deed needs to change. I mean, there's all sorts of things. I mean, you could have just turned 60, in which case you can start a transition to retirement pension.
Yeah,
But if your trustee
exactly.
doesn't actually allow that, then you automatically think it does, and it's maybe a valid assumption to make, but it's dangerous to assume, isn't it? You got to make sure that these things happen. And that's just a simple thing, isn't it? I mean, someone we both know, Tracey, did make the recommendation that if not yearly, if you're into technology, you should at least look at your trust deed every time you change your mobile phone, which on average is about 2 years, I think, for most people. And look, as a rule of thumb, it's probably not such a bad suggestion, really.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that I haven't changed my phone for probably about 4 or 5 years. So so that probably wouldn't work with me, that rule of thumb. But I think that, it's a good habit to get into. And it's one of those things that um it's not as hard as you think, and it's not as costly as you think, right? So if you have to upgrade your trust deed every few years and it costs you a few $100s, $1,000 maybe at the upper end, it's not it's not the end of the world to be able to, do that in the SMSF, but it just does give you access to those latest kind of governing rules. And the worst thing that can happen, Darin, is you don't upgrade your trust deed and then you actually physically can't do something. But
Yeah,
like you said, you might not be able to start a transition to retirement income stream. You might not be able to make a downsizer contribution to the super fund. You might have all of these obscure rules in your governing rules that have issues. And the worst I've ever seen is a problem with a death benefit payout. That there was very specific wording in the trust deed. It's a very old deed, very specific wording in the trust deed that instructed the trustee that it had to do a particular thing. Well, that didn't actually suit the family at the time. So
yeah,
it could have been avoided simply by upgrading a trust deed. And you want to make sure that the rules are flexible enough to be able to allow certain things, but also, to give you direction. The trust deed is where you need to go for the practical day-to-day elements of running the super fund. The SIS law is not where you go for that. The trust deed
no.
is you go for that. And I don't think sometimes we understand that as trustees of self-managed super funds. So first good point.
But and it's a great point, Tracey, because if you are in the mindset of, it's just the CIS regulations and the CIS Act that
Yeah.
that dictate what I can do, it's actually wrong, because you can actually tie yourself into something that you don't necessarily need to do.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're restricted, you don't realize you're restricted, you go ahead and do it, and then you've got a compliance issue. So, uh,
Yeah.
to your point, on the surface, you might think oh, why would I do that? Because it's more expense to me. But if you get it wrong and you face a compliance breach, that's going to be more painful than any deed upgrade that you might do at the time. And of course, the discussion always centers around corporate trustees as well, doesn't it, Tracey?
Absolutely. And the latest stats from the ATO, Darren, I'm a bit of a stat freak, so I like to look at statistics, but the latest stats are much more positive on this front, I think. So what we're finding is that we still have about 30% of self-managed super funds without a corporate trustee.
Right.
So 30% with individual trustees, and of all of the new funds that are being established, we're finding about 12% of new funds still have individual trustees. So that's a much lower figure than it has been in years gone by. And I've been a massive proponent of corporate trustees for a very long time. And, I get the whole fact of, yes, you've got another company, and yes, you've got to pay for that company up front, and you've got to pay the ASIC fee, which, mind you, if it's a special purpose corporate trustee, is only $63. I think it might be 65 moving forward. It's not a lot of money compared to the normal stuff, but having the corporate trustee versus individual trustees is just going to save a whole lot of headache when you really need to save a whole lot of headache. And generally that's when we have a death of one of the members. That is when nobody wants to have to deal with anything more than they have to at that point in time. So corporate trustee really saves us at there. So the second thing on the could do list is to just review your corporate trustee structure. If you don't have one, get one. Is a simple advice. If you do have a corporate trustee, is it special purpose? Are you paying extra ASIC fees unnecessarily? Because if that trustee is only operating for your self-managed super fund, and that's my preference as well, that you don't have a company that's doing multiple things, that you have one company that's only operating your self-managed super fund, only acting in that capacity, then change it to a special purpose corporate trustee and save yourself a few $100s every year. So see, I've given you money back already.
Oh, there's definitely benefits as far as that goes, monetary benefits too, because even if you're not talking about the death of a member, what happens if you introduce a new member to the fund or a new trustee to the fund, and you've got to, obviously the titles of the assets need to be held in the proper name, and that means that all of the titles need to be changed as opposed to you just admit another person into the corporate trustee, which doesn't affect anything else
Yeah.
governing the fund like that. So just imagine how much money that would cost to go through and let alone the pain involved
Yeah.
having to go through that. It's just such an easier structure to manage.
It really is, Darin. And, to your point of that, that's exactly why people don't do the change. Like if you've got an individual trustee right now and I come along and say, you should have a corporate trustee, you're like, oh, but all of the effort I have to go through and that, all of that, just the effort of changing every single, ownership piece of documentation. I get it. And I understand that that is a difficulty. And my comment to that is at some point it's going to have to happen.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, look, hopefully the shortest term pain would be the cost right up
Yeah.
front. So if you're
Yeah.
establishing it, doing that, I know people quibble a little bit about the cost, but that would be the short term gain. And then the short term pain, sorry. And then the short
Yeah.
term pain, if you've already got an individual one and you switch over, yes, I know you're going to have to go through all of that. But again, it's only a bit of short term pain because you'll benefit in the long run, believe me.
Yeah. Once
Yeah,
it's done, right? Once it's done, it's done. So,
that's right.
and I just unfortunately it's when you really don't want to have to go through that. Like I said, it's going to have to happen at some point because we don't have, forever longevity in our lives.
No.
We all have a expiry date, unfortunately. So it's going to have to happen. And I just think that it's better to deal with it. It's better to pull the band-aid off and get it sorted. So second
Yeah,
thing on the resolution list.
100%. And of course, just bear in mind that when obviously a family member would have died, if the SMSF member has died, think of all the trauma that's involved in that without even thinking about things around superannuation. There's all sorts
Yeah.
of other things you're going to have to think about, funeral costs and all that sort of stuff, and the estate itself. Do you
Mm.
really want to be wading through this stuff at that point in time? You're probably not in the best rational position and mindset at the time anyway. So do you really want to be making decisions and having to execute plans like that in that environment? I would suggest not.
Yeah.
And it just gives you that peace of mind. We're all going to have to face it at one point in time. So why not be prepared for it and take that pain point out of it? Seems to make
Yeah,
perfect
exactly.
sense to me. But
It really does make sense, Darin. And, which is why it's so surprising to me sometimes when I look at the stats and I'm like, still, what's 30% of 630,000 funds or however many funds we've got at the moment? Like it's still quite a high percentage. And
yeah,
it
it
always
is.
kind of, astounds me that, I always go, why have you got it? Why? Why? But it's easy to say that if you don't have to do the legwork to change everything. And I get that. But like I said, unfortunately, at some point, it's going to have to happen. So do it earlier. It's much better to do
True.
that.
True, we'd like to make a push to 100% corporate trustees.
We
Not that
would.
we can get
We
there,
would.
but we can do our little bit to help getting
We can.
to that result. I suppose in line with what we've just talked about with the timing of the trust deed, which is a very
Mhm.
important document, but hand in hand with that, another really important document for the fund is the investment strategy. And of
Sure
course,
is.
this is probably one that people would likely understand a little bit better because, with markets as well as your life situation, they vary from year to year, obviously. I
Yeah.
mean, gosh, the markets go look at what's happening with the US Liberation Day, how
Mm.
markets sort of changed and they're dropping and then rebounding, and there's all sorts of uncertainty happening. So if that doesn't encourage you to, oh, maybe I should have a look at my investment strategy. I don't know what will, but it's always good practice to go back and revisit it. And what better time again than the end of financial year?
Absolutely. And I think there's seems like there's two crucial times that people talk about investment strategies. And that's one when they get their financial accounts sorted. And sometimes that's because their investment strategy might not be quite in line with where their investments are sitting. And the second is when I tell them about it at the end of financial year. So it is a good New Year's resolution point, Darin, to look at the investment strategy. And surprisingly, Darin, I think where the investment strategy tends to go wrong most of the time in practice is where you've actually got those percentage allocations across the asset
Yeah.
classes. So I was reviewing an investment strategy not so long ago, and it had something along the lines of direct property 1 to 99%, which is a very bizarre range of like numbers to pop on an investment strategy. But the fund held 20% in cash. So it was kind of like, but there was no allocation on the investment strategy for cash, which again, very strange when you're talking about the liquidity of the SMSF. So I think perhaps maybe the trustee of that particular fund didn't quite understand what that asset allocation meant. But when it tends to go wrong, it's because your investment strategy is saying this particular allocation. If you're not adhering to your own allocation, why? Why do you have that particular strategy in place, or why do you have that particular range of numbers in place? So my advice really is, and what I prefer to see is no ranges of an asset allocation. You don't have to. There's no requirement on the investment strategy for you to have a percentage range of every particular asset class. So why make it more difficult for yourself? Still have to deal with all of the elements of the investment strategy around diversification and liquidity and risk management and all of those sorts of things, but you don't have to have a percentage allocation. So maybe have a look at your investment strategy as part of your New Year resolution, and just make it a bit simpler for yourself and your auditor and your accountant and everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that message is ever probably strongly put forward enough.
Mm.
Even with, I know that the ATO is not going to tell you not to do it, but the fact of the matter that they say it's okay to have those almost, I think, perceptibly gives it the green light that, yeah, it's okay if I do that. And of course, you mentioned 0 to 99%. I'm not sure what happens to the final 1% there. But a lot of investment strategies have, oh, I can do Australian shares 0 to 100%. Well, if it's 0 to 100%, what does that actually effectively achieve?
What's the strategy?
Like nothing. If it's 0 to 100%, what's that telling me? That you
Yeah,
just can do it? Well, then why put a range on it? It
yeah.
seems silly. And again, this is one of these things, isn't it, Tracy, where it's dangerous to assume if you don't review a document like this on a regular basis, it's dangerous to assume what you can and can't do within your fund, even though
Hmm.
you may think it's a logical thing. I mean, going back to the merchant case, which a lot of people are talking about, which is like a watershed moment in the SMSF world, as far as several compliance issues, of course. With that, the latest deed upgrade I think Gordon Merchant had was it didn't allow him to have property in the fund.
Mhm.
I know that sounds strange because a lot of SMSFs have property allocations, and it's one of the most popular asset classes in an SMSF and among SMSF trustees. But the investment strategy didn't allow for it, and yet he had a property in his fund.
I
So
know,
it's,
right?
well, that's crazy.
Yeah.
I know, it's really basic, and it would almost prompt the question if you didn't know, well, who wouldn't be allowed to have a property in their SMSF? You know,
Yes.
okay, yeah, granted, it's a valid question. Who wouldn't? You're right. It's such a popular thing. But that deed did that investment strategy didn't.
Yeah.
No matter if you think, oh, who wouldn't? That's just a
Yeah.
no-brainer. Well, that one didn't. And of course,
Exactly.
then you think that who wouldn't? Of course, mine has. I'll go and get that property, and it's like, hang on, Darin, you weren't actually allowed to do that.
You
What?
weren't, you actually breached your own rules. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Exactly.
didn't you review the deed? Well, no, I just thought that it was a
Assumed.
given, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where I think, there's so many idiosyncrasies in the self-managed super fund space. And I think this is one of those that just because there's, we've got this concept of governing rules, right? So, and the governing rules include all of these, all of these things. And so you've got to adhere to your governing rules. And if you don't adhere to your own governing rules, then you technically have a breach of the superannuation rules. So you've got to be mindful about what does your specific rules say? And if your specific rules don't allow for something to happen, then you've got to be very mindful around, well, how do I go about doing that? So the investment strategy is a crucial document. It's a required document. We have, in the superannuation laws, we are required to formulate and give effect to an investment strategy.
Yeah.
And that's one of our trustee responsibilities. And in fact, we sign a document with the ATO that says we understand that this is what we're going to do. So if we don't have the investment strategy, I'd be very surprised if a fund has gone through an audit without an investment strategy, because that certainly would have been a review point from the auditors. But if we've got a new fund without an investment strategy, or an investment strategy that is, completely out of whack with the investments, then now's just a good time to get that sorted. And I saw a report for a super fund, a new fund I was looking at a few years ago, Darin, and it had this beautiful graph, beautiful pie chart of here's the investment strategy and here's all of the permitted investments under the investment strategy. And on the same page, it had here's the actual investments. Not one of the investments adhered to the graph space. And I'm kind of like, why are you doing this? Kind of doesn't make sense. Left hand, right hand, like, what's going on? So, it looks pretty, but it doesn't actually mean anything.
Just an admission of failure there by the sound of
Yeah. Like
it.
saying, okay, ATO, I do have an investment strategy, but I'm not following it. So
Yeah,
come
exactly.
and come and
Exactly.
check me out.
Do, do, do what you will with me.
Exactly,
Absolute
exactly.
confession.
So important for resolutions, these resolutions are not like our exercise resolutions, Daz, that we set at the 1st of January for a squillion hours of push-ups every week and we don't last a day. But these are more easily achievable resolutions in the SMSF space, I think.
Yep. And as we move down the list, I think some of these are a little bit more logical again because they'll probably be a little bit more top of mind of people
Sure,
rather than these sort of housekeeping issues, I suppose you could call them. And of course,
absolutely.
the contributions caps is something you should look at and how you've utilized them, whether or not you fully utilize them, what you can do.
Yeah, exactly. So contribution caps, we've got 30,000 concessional contribution cap, 4 times that for our non-concessional at 120,000. So looking at, well, what are we going to do for the next financial year? Are we salary sacrificing? And if we are going to salary sacrifice or revise our salary sacrifice arrangements, it's really good to do that at the beginning of the year. So you've kind of got, that full whole 12-month period of the financial year to make effective that salary sacrifice arrangement. If we're going to be funding that from our businesses, what does the cash flow look like? It's just good to plan these things ahead. Have we got the ability under the catch-up concessional contributions to make those additional contributions in this financial year this coming financial year? And are we going to bring effect to the bring forward rules if we want to increase the non-concessional? So now's a good time, if you haven't already, just to plan ahead in terms of how you're going to get money into the fund and what does that actually look like. So the money going into the fund earlier in the year might actually be more beneficial for the growth of the SMSF.
Yeah, and of course, this is going to be more of an issue as we cross into the new financial year in the lead up,
Mhm.
obviously, to the first measurement of the Division 296 tax, which we all assume will actually go through. That
Yeah,
then you're going to have to figure out, well, if you're close to that threshold, what do I do with my contributions and how do I
that's right.
recapture this? So this is an ongoing sort of thing, but I know that. Unfortunately, people do tend to leave this one to the last minute. Oh,
Mm,
how much more can I get in, before 30th of June comes around? We would
yeah.
probably encourage you to have a look at that as early as possible in the planning stage, but better late than never. At least you're looking at it before 30th of June. So it is a really
Yeah.
important thing to consider, and obviously in the lead up to year end as well, because again, what if you want to do a contribution reserving strategy? You can
Exactly.
actually only do that in the straddle of June and July. So
That's right.
it's another thing to consider in
Yeah,
that.
absolutely, Darren. And if you haven't done a contribution reserving strategy and you want to do that, then you have very limited time to actually talk to your accountant advisor about that, given we're kind of mid-June. So anything about getting money in, it's really important to have an understanding about how much can you get in? So what are the general caps around what you can get in? And then how much specifically do you have left of your available cap space? And so, once we flip over to the new financial year, we've basically got all of our cap space for that financial year, unless we've, brought some things forward. So having that understanding in terms of the changes to thresholds is crucial. And so it should be on your New Year's resolution list if you haven't spoken to your accountant advisor about that, to actually put that as a discussion point. So, planning for the next 12 months, well, what does that look like for you? And can you maximize the amount that you can actually get into super should you have the cash flow to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to actually jump around a little bit.
Go for it.
Tracy versus our agreed order, but I just thought that if you're talking about changing thresholds, it's probably a good point to raise the fact that the transfer balance cap is going to change as of 1 July next year, going from $1.9 million as it currently is to $2
Yeah.
million. And that's got all sorts of other implications as well as your strategies moving forward,
Yeah.
doesn't it, Trace?
Sure does, Darren. So for for us in the advisory slash accounting space, we love it when thresholds change because it just means we've got another number to remember. So that's always a fun thing in our world. And sometimes you have to go, oh, what is the number actually currently and where does that fit? So you're absolutely right. So the transfer balance cap, the general transfer balance cap, is going to be changing from 1 July 2025, and it's going to be increasing to $2 million. So what that effectively means for anyone who hasn't yet started a retirement phase income stream, an account-based pension in retirement phase, then you will have the ability to now commence the retirement phase income stream up to that $2 million cap. For anyone that has already commenced a retirement phase income stream, you don't have $2 million cap available. You will have somewhere between 1.6 million and $2 million. So it depends on how much of your original cap, available cap, you used versus how much indexation you actually get. So which is always a bit of a harebrained calculation because we've gone from 1.6 to 1.7 to 1.9 to $2 million. So we've got lots of different, thresholds and caps, but certainly your accountant and administrator will be able to help you out in terms of, well, what available cap do you have? And, that technical term that I say often, you'll be capped out at some point in time. So do you have any available cap space? But for anyone who's not started that kind of retirement phase income stream, does have that $2 million cap to look forward to from 1 July. So just let's clarify really quickly, Darren, if you've got a transition to retirement income stream, that is not retirement phase. That's still accumulation phase. So therefore you wouldn't have allocated any of that against that $2 million threshold. So another little idiosyncrasy in the wording of our rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we keep moving through these should could do's, sorry, I'm getting
Yeah,
confused. So could
that's
do.
okay.
We touch on a couple of things which are actually prevalent in the unfortunately the Div 296 tax discussion that seems to be dominating news cycles right
Mm,
now.
mm.
But liquidity is one, and of course liquidity's been brought up about, well, how do I pay the tax? But liquidity is an ongoing issue and an obligation for trustees with meeting the liquidity requirements of whatever they have to do with inside their fund. And again, good opportunity to have a look at how that's going.
Yeah, absolutely. So liquidity is a really important thing to look at on an ongoing basis. It's not just a once-off. So when you start your pension, right? So you go, yep, I've met condition of release. I'm the right age. I've met condition of release. I'm going to start a pension. Great, that's all good and well. But that decision around starting a pension is not just a one-off thing. You've got to actually review that. So every year, if you start that pension, you have a minimum amount of money that you've got to take out of the super fund. If you fail to make that minimum payment, then there is some discretion from the ATO as to whether they'll allow, that kind of failure to pay the minimum, let it slide more or less. But if they don't, or if it's kind of a repeat, if it's not minor, if it's more of a larger issue, then you've got a whole lot of problem around the pension. So the pension effectively has to cease. And so, that can cause all sorts of other things in terms of the tax amount and the tax exemption that you might have in the fund. So liquidity, I think, is one of those considerations that at the beginning of the year, you should be doing a little bit of cash flow. What is the cash flow look like for the super fund? What income am I expecting to bring into the super fund? What outgoings have I got to pay from the super fund, including the minimum pension that I have to pay to myself? Because the last thing you want to see happen, Darin, in June of next year is that, oh, I don't have enough money to meet my minimum pension now. What am I going to do? And so some of the strategies to help with that is that you might want to actually structure your pension so that you have more than one pension, for example. So if you've got only one pension and you fail to meet the minimum and you can't get any discretion around that failure to meet the minimum, then that whole of the pension might need to stop and you might have to then recommence that pension, which at face value is not a big deal, but there are some ramifications of that. But where you have multiple pensions, if you fail to meet the minimum across the multiple pensions, then you might be able to sacrifice one of the pensions, for want of a better explanation, and keep all of the other pensions afoot. So it just gives you a fallback position and a plan B should things not go exactly to plan.
And obviously another one, speaking of super fund property valuations, valuations is another thing that you should look at around
Yeah, for
this
sure.
time of year, if not slightly earlier, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we really need to be, one of the must-dos, of course, that we talked about a few weeks ago, or quite a few weeks ago now, was that you have to get the market valuation. And, for anyone who still thinks that, once every 3 years is okay, it's not okay. You can't just rely on a valuation from a few years ago. You've got to have up-to-date valuation. So once you know what the valuation is for 30 June 2025, and unfortunately some of our funds don't get valuations done until kind of April next year because their accountants and auditors are saying, where's the valuation from June 2025? Well,
Yeah.
I think you should get it done earlier because the valuation drives a whole lot of things. So for example, let's say that you've got a property in the fund, Darin, and your valuation has this, exponential increase in the valuation of that particular property, larger than what you expected, right? If you don't get that valuation done until like later in the financial year, you could have a huge impact on the liquidity of funding those minimum pensions. Whereas if you get it done closer to the 30 June period, which is when it will be effective from anyway, then at least it gives you some foresight into, well, what is my pension that I have to meet for the 2026 financial year? So it just makes it easier. If we're organized and we have this checkbox, and this is why these are the could do's, you should be doing other things, but these are the things you could be doing to make your life a whole lot easier and to make the management of your SMSF much more effective and easier to manage.
Yeah, of course. And while we recommend against it, just in case you did have an investment strategy with percentages, how do you monitor those percent? How do you monitor those percentages if you don't get up to date valuations? You can't.
Yeah, exactly.
So
And
don't have the
you can't
percentages,
have naught
but
to 100.
no, no. So, but it's good practice, obviously, to get these things done, and really,
For sure.
it's an obligation. That 3 year thing is something that people fall back on, but it's
Yes.
actually a myth that you don't have to get up to date valuations all the time. And of course, on a really cheery note, it's probably something that you need to look to as well at this time of year, and that's of course any sort of estate planning considerations, because like any end of year, people do reflect on their own position, on their own mortality, if you want to call it, and
Yeah.
what they have in place, what they don't have in place, and we should prepare for this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is a little bit of a, more of a morbid topic. However, it's such an important thing to consider, Darren. And what the question to ask yourself is when something happens to me. So if I was hit by a bus yesterday, so let's past tense it. If I was hit by a bus yesterday, what do I want my super fund to look like today? How do I want my super fund to look after my loved ones today? And so once we frame that question and we think about all of the things that we want to look, how we want to look after our loved ones, then the next stage is to get the documentation in place so that can happen. It's no good kind of asking the first question if nothing then happens. So, however, in saying that, you could just leave it up to everyone else to decide because, you won't be around. So therefore, what do you care? And that kind of is a fairly valid estate plan, I guess. But you might have some wishes and, your loved ones might actually want you to put some wishes in place. So estate planning is, again, something to reflect upon. And I think that there's a lot of idiosyncrasies around the estate planning, Darin. And so often we see at the coalface, we often see, a super fund was established and this little document called the binding death benefit nomination was signed when the super fund was established because it was just one of the pages, and so it had a signature spot, so you just signed it. Is it valid? Should you have a binding death benefit nomination? Should you be forcing your trustees to do this particular thing? And if you do have that document in place, is it actually valid to start with? And, there's a lot of war stories around, the validity of binding death benefit nominations, because if you are an aggrieved party that's not getting something that you thought you should be entitled to, then you're going to try and attack the documentation that says that you're not entitled to it. So again, resolution around having a look at what is in place in your current self-managed super fund documentation and governing rules. Are they current? Is that still what you want to see happen? Do you have the right people that are going to help make those decisions when the time comes? And how should it be updated? Just a great, great little checklist to be able to make sure it's all going to be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great segue to remind listeners and viewers of this podcast about our upcoming SMSF Trustee Empowerment Day
Yep.
2025, which is taking place on the 16th of September in Sydney and the 18th of September in Melbourne, because Tracey's going to be talking about estate planning on that day. So if you want
I
to hear
am.
more about that and obviously ask her some questions about it, if your own personal situation causes you a little bit of confusion and you want some clarity around it, what better opportunity than to ask the expert herself? So just a reminder that that's happening in September, and please register because it's going to be a great event as usual.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really it sounds wrong to say I'm looking forward to talking about death and estate planning, but it's such a crucial part. And I've been involved in so many cases now, Darren, of clients where um it's just a really hard time for the family. And so my clients who have had the estate planning documents for their super fund in place and it's all been very clear, it just makes the whole process a whole lot easier for those who are left behind. And so I'll be sharing a number of war stories with the attendees and just some really practical tips. And hopefully very easy to follow, processes so that it just makes it one of those things where it's not overwhelming, it's not foreign, it's not unfamiliar, because you've got like something you can follow through, and it just makes it easier for everyone. So that's my plan.
Yeah, look, on the surface, it might the subject might be a little bit morbid, but we're actually putting a positive spin on it because what we're trying to do is create the best outcome
Sure.
in obviously what's going to be a fairly distressing situation for you. So
Yeah,
what could be better than
absolutely.
that? Just to have a bit of peace of mind in that whole circumstance. But
Yeah.
other than that, Tracy, we've run out of time as usual. So I just wanted to thank you for giving me your time to join me on this podcast as usual. And of course, you've given some great insights.
My pleasure, Darin. It's been nice to do this little series around end of financial year planning. So, but looking forward to the next range of topics to come post end of financial year. So stay tuned.
That should be great. Thanks again to Superfund Property Valuations for their continued support. Thanks to my production team for putting these podcasts together and, of course, posting it on all of the mediums that we do. Don't forget, if you're enjoying our content on YouTube, smash that like button and hit subscribe as well. Other than that, thanks for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. And we look forward to seeing you again when we next present the Trusted Trustee podcast. Travel safely and bye for now.
Thanks very much.